Well, we have 4 questions that have come in. I'll just start at the top, and others can come in as we go, and unless it runs something off my screen, we'll be all right. Here's a question. With the recent Supreme Court action, what can we really do to make a difference? Have we already lost the contest? It's not directed at anyone. I'll invite first Ryan and Sherif if they'd like to, and anyone else who'd like to respond.
Sure. Yep, this is working. That's a great question. And one of the things that we've been saying for a while now, so long before the Supreme Court did its action of 2 weeks ago, was that the pro-marriage movement needed to look towards the pro-life movement as its model. That it would have been really easy in February of 1973 for the pro-life movement to say, well, the Supreme Court just said there's a constitutional right to abortion, so we should just give up and go home. And it would have been real easy at the time, partly because public opinion polling was turning against the pro-life movement. In the late 70s, the law taught something, and after Roe, many people came to believe that there actually is a constitutional right to abortion. And then all of the media elites kept insisting, well, look, all of the young people, they're against you. And they said, the same demographic point that they look to now, that all the young people are in favor of abortion. And then pro-life politicians evolved and became pro-choice. We sometimes forget that Ted Kennedy and Al Gore and Bill Clinton and Jesse Jackson began their political careers as pro-life politicians, and then they evolved and became pro-choice. So it would have been really easy to give up with that much going against the pro-lifers, but they didn't give up. They got to work. They started organizing coalitions, think tanks. They made the scientific arguments, the moral arguments, the legal arguments. They witnessed to the truth about unborn human life. And now Sherif's and my generation is more pro-life than our parents' generation. All of that work has borne fruit. More pro-life laws have been passed at the state level in the past decade than in the previous 30 years combined. And little by little, we're chipping away at the Roe v. Wade ruling, but more importantly, little by little, we're winning hearts and minds about the dignity of unborn human life. We have networks of crisis pregnancy centers, and we're making a real impact. The abortion rate has finally started to decrease. Now, the question is, what can we do? What can we learn from the pro-life movement, given what's taken place? So let me first just say a word about what did take place 2 weeks ago. The Supreme Court declined to review the 10th Circuit and the 4th Circuit and the 7th Circuit decisions that struck down marriage laws in 5 states, including the state of Utah. So the 10th Circuit had upheld the decision that struck down your marriage law. The Supreme Court, by not reviewing it, more or less left it in place, at least for now. And the reason I say that is there are still state marriage laws that are being litigated in the 5th Circuit in particular. The state of Louisiana had its marriage law upheld about 2 months ago. That's now being appealed to the 5th Circuit Court. The 5th Circuit Court is probably the most reasonable of all of the circuit courts, so there's a good chance that the 5th Circuit Court could uphold that state's marriage law. Alabama is litigating its marriage law right now, and they have one of the best defenses going for that. They've learned from all of the other states. Each state keeps getting better and better at this, learning from the previous cases. Alabama's law could be upheld. If that eventually gets to the Supreme Court, if it takes a couple of months or a year, there might be a different 9 members of the court. If there's a switch on the court, if someone has to resign because of old age or illness or, God forbid, death, I mean, these things can happen. The court may not be the current 5-4 vote that many people hypothesize. Right now, it looks like it's a 5-4 decision to strike down marriage laws. So we should continue litigating all of these battles because we don't know what will happen. If the Republicans were to gain control of the Senate in 2 weeks with the election, we don't know what would then look like for the last 2 years of Obama making appointments to the courts. If the Republicans then win the White House in 2016, we don't know what the court looks like then. So one nice thing so far is that the court hasn't given us a Roe v. Wade of marriage. There isn't a Supreme Court ruling that'll be as entrenched as the abortion ruling, so it does give us some hope politically. But the last thing I'll say is that regardless of what happens politically or legally, I think each of us is kind of called within our own vocations, whether it's as scholars or think tank people or lawyers or policymakers or artists or pastors or musicians, film stars, whatever, to live out the truth about marriage. And so part of that will be protecting the religious freedom for universities and churches and businesses to do that. Part of that will just be living out marriage in your own life and your own families. Part of that will be not being afraid to do the scholarship that might be controversial. And, we have good people on the panel here that are doing that sort of research. None of that changes. The Supreme Court doesn't in any way prevent us from speaking or acting out the truth of marriage.
Go ahead.
Let me just add one thing to that. I think when it comes to making arguments, we need to think about the culture of marriage in a variety of levels. And so we emphasize in that question the legal level. But we also need to contemplate the social understandings and meanings. But then we also have patterns within individual faith groups. And there's also the argument ultimately within each individual's heart. And this is not an isolated issue. We see it among our young people. We see it among those coming of age, that it's not just simply an issue about marriage. It also becomes how they think about faith in general. They're belonging to a faith community. And so at all those different levels, the argument and the evidence and the discussion is so deeply needed. So I think if we put this down simply into a legal discussion or a legal definition, we miss a variety of levels that continue to be so deeply crucial, and as Ryan points out, intertwined and interconnected as well.
Let me get to there are a couple questions here that I want to make sure we get to. They're related. One is, what about, how can we be true to our beliefs about marriage and yet compassionate and loving for those in same-sex marriages or with same-sex attraction? What can we say to our same-sex attracted friends who are ostracized, our stance of marriage? I know you've all had experience with that. Maybe a brief response from as many as would like. That's a key issue.
Sure, yeah. I'll say just a few things about that. That does come up a lot in discussions and everywhere around the country. One thing to note is that among the rank and file, among folks who aren't leading the charge for some major social revolution in our mores, who don't hate the patriarchal structure of the family and so on, among most rank and file folks who support redefining marriage, they just think this is about preventing loneliness. And that's the need you have to speak to with friends who are same-sex attracted or who think that they're headed for a bleak future without marriage. They have to understand the deep forms of community, of friendship, of intimacy, of emotional affirmation and advice and all the rest of it are available outside of a sexual and marital context. And that the body of Christ, above all things, provides the deep forms of community and welcome that really aren't available from a secular perspective outside of something like marriage. So it's a part of the harm here is the mistaken view of marriage that just says you've got marriage and intimacy over here and you've got superficiality and friendship over there. And the one last thing in this connection, there's a growing movement of Christians with same-sex attractions who are coming out and saying, we have these attractions, they're not going away, but we're embracing the church's understanding of sex and marriage. We're leading flourishing lives. We're talking about what a vocation to friendship and to ministry and to service looks like. So spiritualfriendship.org is one blog that I would recommend to anybody who has a friend or a relative or is himself or herself in this situation.
I think with that, as we were discussing earlier, what we could do, I remember my faculty advisor, Bill Doherty, who's a well-known family therapist, who was trained in the early 70s, talking about that when divorce started increasing so dramatically, he said, we as social scientists, smart social scientists, thought it was really going to be like a bad cold for a child. It would be intense for a little while, and then they'd just get over it, and it wouldn't be a big deal. And then, of course, what came out more than a decade later is that it was not, in fact, like that children suffered in every aspect of development for a long time. And so what happens is it feels like we get an increased understanding. We have to discuss it. We have to share what we know, what we learn, and that then informs how we see marriage and how we see relationships. Certainly, along with Sherif sharing that, in the LDS community, we have LDS Voices of Hope. That's been this powerful witness that couples and single people who live lives that are chaste or who are married in heterosexual marriages are flourishing, happy, have beautiful marriages, have beautiful lives, and they bear witness about what marriage is based on, what happiness in married life is based on, in a way that we need. We need those stories to be told. They have been so silenced by the larger community that says there's only two choices: to either swallow and choose a life that either leads to complete depression or suicide, or to embrace your sexuality as the only defining characteristic of your life, and to embrace the gay rights movement. Well, that political agenda has silenced the many who, as Sherif noted, are happy, flourishing individuals who live lives consistent with a culture that wants to support and strengthen marriage for all people, regardless of their sexual attractions.
One quick question. It asks, would you give us a strong, brief answer to the question, why doesn't the government just stop recognizing marriages, no longer care if someone's married legally or not? What does this do to children?
Sure. The quick answer to that, this is like the libertarian argument. Well, what if we just got government out of the marriage business? And that, as appealing as that looks up front for what it would mean for liberty, we have to think about, by getting out of the marriage business on the front end, it will actually put the state into more marriage decisions at the back end. Because by not defining up front who the married parents are, how parents come into custody of their children, you'll have much more government interference in making decisions about custody and alimony and child support payments. And insofar as you have anything that weakens the signal that marriage is a normative institution, an institution that is the norm for adults to get into, stay in before they have children, it will just further weaken the marriage culture, which then leads to the growth of the state in terms of welfare state, police state, and then also just the legal proceedings of now governing non-related men and women who have had children together, because now they're not married to each other.
One quick question has come in. Europe has been at this longer than we have. What do the data say? In the opinion of many, it's not a big deal. Anybody? Mark?
Sure.
He said data.
Yeah. I'll borrow yours. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the legal side of this stuff because I don't pay particular attention to the legal side of this. In terms of the data in Europe, there's a handful of states that have, or nations that have legalized same-sex marriage. I think the earliest was the Netherlands. Scandinavia is known for this, etc. The data is mixed, and it depends on what kind of outcome you want to look at. If we're talking about children's flourishing, or you want to talk about the stability of couples, etc. One of the most interesting pieces of information came out of the Netherlands early this year in the journal Demography, where they looked at sort of the impact of the legalization of same-sex marriage on the marriage rates of heterosexuals. And when you look at it overall, there's no difference, right? And one could just sort of say, hey, that's the conclusion of this. It doesn't affect it. You dig deeper, which is the job of social scientists, is always to dig deeper. You see that in the most religious part of the Netherlands, and it's hard to believe, but there are religious people in the Netherlands. My family was one of them a long time ago. Marriage rates actually increased. And among the rest of the population, they decreased, such that when they pooled them all together, it was basically a no effect, right? But it's affecting different people differently, such that when I saw it, I started asking around, anybody know any Dutch pastors? Because I want to know, like, did they see something going on in their parishes or in their churches? I've had no success getting a hold of any. But it's one of those things where the effects of a policy can be glimpsed at a whole and seem one way. It can be glimpsed sort of more narrowly, and the story would be more nuanced. So that's just on one of the questions that people have been asking about. Does same-sex marriage affect other people's marriages or marriage rates? Maybe, maybe not. So, but that scratching the surface of the story about Europe and variety of outcomes.
Mark could probably say more about this too, but we do know that the stability of relationships, is particularly lesbian relationships, they're much less stable than heterosexual relationships. So they last for fewer months in fact, averages, I think, maybe you know that data better, but like 18 months. I mean, that relationships, particularly among lesbians, are short term. They're just much more likely to be volatile and to change, and that's been consistent across those nations in terms of looking at what legalizing marriage looks like in those types of marriages.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second when I'm up on the podium. But in general, except for Britain, we've seen this sort of effect of women's relationships are a little bit more unstable than heterosexual relationships and gay men's relationships, and I'll offer an explanation for why I think that's the case.
One quick question about the advisability of adding sexual preference as part of a non-discrimination law, that is, granting protected status on that basis, as it's been done a number of places. Just a general question.
Yep, really bad idea. It's all of those cases that I mentioned with the baker, the florist, the photographer, the farmers, the pastors, Catholic charities, adoption agencies, those were all litigated under a sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination statute. So either the state or the city had passed a law that said it will be illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And then they said, well, viewing marriage as the union of a man and a woman just is discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Likewise, thinking that biological men should go to the men's restroom and that biological women should go to the women's restroom would be discrimination on the basis of gender identity for someone who's transgender. That's what's going on in Houston right now, where you've seen some of the controversy over what they've called the bathroom bill, because they passed a non-discrimination ordinance that included gender identity, which would therefore include that you would use the restroom of your choice. So I think it's much better to leave this stuff to civil society, freedom of association, free contract, free speech, free religion, without the government stepping in and regulating, well, which of those decisions will now constitute illegal discrimination.
And it's important to see the reason why. The reason why is not, well, discrimination in this realm is okay. It's that our legal system is thoroughly and pervasively committed to interpreting these things in a very specific way that's very morally charged and that's supposed to look neutral and align itself with civil rights.
I'm going to make a decision here, and just there were lots of great questions came in. I'm sorry we don't have time for all of them. Just two. One begins, since the primary opposition to same-sex marriage has to do with children, how can we oppose same-sex unions if they're prohibited from adopting? My own view is, that second part's not going to happen, but I'd like to talk a little bit about, is the central issue children? Anyone?
Sure. Well, the central issue is really the nature of the marital relationship. And I don't know anyone who has been in favor of prohibiting or banning or criminalizing same-sex marriage. The question was always going to be, what will be the legal definition of marriage for the state of Utah? And in the state of Utah, that left same-sex attracted people free to live with each other and love each other, free to go to a progressive church and have a wedding ceremony, free to work for a business and receive marriage benefits. None of that was ever prohibited or banned or somehow criminalized by the state amendment that you all passed, defining marriage as the union of a man and a woman. So it's not. So I think part of the question of, would you still be against same-sex marriage? It depends what you mean. I think from my perspective is that we want the law to be promoting the truth about what marriage is, partly because of its pedagogical, its teaching function, but then also because partly that if you do redefine marriage, it raises the question of what lines do you draw and why? What is your principle for including the same-sex couple but not the throuple? What's your principle for including the permanent but not the temporary, the sexually faithful but not the sexually open relationship?
Just one other, and this is an important question because all five of you embody it. It says, as a young working professional, how can I get involved with with this movement in establishing a marriage culture without jeopardizing my professional future? We'll end with that.
Well, I'll say a quick thing about that. The jury's not in yet on whether I'll have a job one day. But in the meantime, the way I've been thinking about it is this. This is a matter of vocation, and it's a matter of discernment of what your vocation is. It definitely involves risks to be open about this stuff. There's no denying that. I don't think everybody absolutely must take that risk. So some people may be called to work and to work in venues that require them to be quieter for a while. There are risks with being quiet, mainly that you get so used to that defensive and crouched posture that you stay that way. And that's a moral risk. It's a moral hazard. In between, I think you just have to think about, given your circumstances, given your opportunities, the responsibilities you already have or will have soon to family and whatever else, what risks can you reasonably take? And if you do take them and you discern that you're called to, having a deep faith and trust in God and in the community that you're a part of, seeking the normal forms of support and professional network and association that can at least give you some kind of cushion, and then just being cheerful and confident about it. You'd be surprised what a difference it makes to be calm and cheerful and confident in your own views, even to whether and to what extent other people punish you for them, because they often are insecure about their own opposition to you. And there's a kind of groupthink that gets a lot of energy out of silencing the opposition. But if the opposition walks in and has a little bit of spring in their step and isn't worried about whether they're bigots or on the wrong side of history or anything like that, that can actually also affect how people treat you.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
I mean, some practical advice is that there will always be professional risks and fear of retaliation. So there's no way of doing this that avoids that. But if you are going to do it, one thing is to look at what Mark and Sherif have done, is just do it better than anyone else. When Professor Regneris' study came out, he had one of the most prominent liberal sociologists saying, this is the best study that has been published to date. That didn't prevent the rest of the sociology world from attacking Mark's study. But imagine if Mark would have done shoddy research. Imagine if Mark's study wouldn't have been as rigorously constructed and as rigorously executed as it actually was. Same thing with Sherif. Imagine if Sherif was writing shoddy law review articles. So it's important that if you're going to be taking a position that's somewhat controversial, execute it at the best of your ability. Not everyone can be a Rhodes Scholar like Sherif is, but Sherif will have greater success by doing as good of a job at his job as he can. And I think that's the Alliance Defending Freedom. They litigate a bunch of these cases. They have a phrase where they say, piety is no substitute for competency. So whatever your particular discipline is, whether it's philosophy or law or social science, do it to the very best of your ability, and don't kind of allow yourself to get attacked on the easy criticism that, well, you just didn't do a good job in the first place. And the second thing is, I think, always take the high road. One of the things that's incredibly frustrating for us is that many of our opponents do not play fairly. And it's like, well, if we could do some of the things they do, we'd have greater, but you can't. I mean, it's wrong to do that, and don't kind of weaken your standards of what the right sort of terms of engagement are. So even if your opponents are taking pot shots, don't reply in kind. Always take the high road in terms of civility and respect and decency.
We have longer than I thought, so we'll go ahead and pursue this.
One thought, too, that I think is important, hopefully you've already started to hear, that the idea of revitalizing a marriage culture and what we see happening. Right now, of course, much of the attention is focused on the legalization of same-sex marriage. And it's being made out to be the single topic, the one issue that is going on here. But you've already heard in Richard's comments, in Sherif and Ryan's comments, but we'll hear later in the afternoon as well. This is a much broader, multifaceted trend and pattern we see in the devitalization of marriage. And when we look at patterns of non-marital childbirth rates, when we look at, as we've had mentioned already, around no-fault divorce and divorce trends and patterns, there needs to be a consistency in that. I think sometimes when we get too focused or solely focused on the legal issues around definitions of same-sex marriage, it does appear as if it is an isolated, independent topic. And fundamentally, that's a disservice to any effort to revitalize the marriage culture in our society today, to have only one note of the piano. There's much, much more of that that's at the broader level, but also in our personal lives and our own views and prioritization of marriage and family. So I think taking that broader view helps it feel much more about an effort that is in favor of something rather than a single issue that gets cast as if we are against something. That's a different pattern that helps us take the tone and the message that Ryan was suggesting.
Other responses to that?
I just really appreciated Sherif's use of the word, the expression, this is about the law of love, meaning the way God has ordained marriage. We can, with confidence, as we see it reflected in social science, as we see it reflected in the legal world, and that we can, with confidence, know that it is consistent with God's law of love. That when we talk about marriage, the way that it's created, what it does for children, what it does for spouses, husbands and wives, it enriches, ennobles, blesses, helps, that ideal is based in love. And we can speak with confidence about that. For all people, that is the truth. I have one girl that her dad left her mom when she was young, and she's now struggling with what marriage means, and her notions are, well, I had a bad growing up, and this was not ideal for me, so shouldn't we just accept everybody's bad growing up? Because we can't have a world in which there is an ideal. But what a hopeless place to be in. We must hold to the ideal, if only for the hope that it gives all of humanity, that there is possibility for living the way we all know we truly want to live and love.
One quick question regarding, and I know Ryan and Sherif, you've written on this. The rest of you probably can weigh in. The argument that, and this is again same-sex marriage, not marriage more broadly, but since that's the topic of currency, what about the childless heterosexual couples? How do we negotiate that terrain?
Yeah, well, the couple that's without children in general, like the couple that's fertile but it's on their wedding night, or it's a year before their first kid, or it's 5 years after their last one leaves for college, all of these are on a spectrum in this respect. They all have comprehensive union. They all have genuine marriages. They have a union of heart, mind, and body. They have coordinated towards a single end that makes them up. For that reason, they are called to permanence and exclusivity in a way that's independent of just what they happen to prefer or to desire. For those reasons, because it's genuinely a marriage, recognizing it doesn't have any of the harms of recognizing non-marital relationships. It doesn't send the signal that moms and dads are replaceable, that marriage is mainly about adult emotional fulfillment, that it lasts as long as the feeling does. And recognizing infertile relationships actually has one benefit over simply a scheme that would have recognized only fertile opposite-sex couples. I mean, besides the practical benefits, that it's very invasive of privacy to try to figure out who's fertile and infertile. But aside from that, it also sends the signal that Richard began with in his introduction, which is that marriage matters for its own sake. Marriage, understood as a comprehensive union, so you need a man and a woman to get it off the ground at all, has inherent value. That's something we don't want our law to obscure by only treating marriage as a form of boosting SAT scores. And if we do that, if we do learn and internalize as a culture the idea that marriage matters in itself, which the law helps by recognizing all genuinely marital relationships, we're going to get more of the instrumental benefits of marriage anyway. The more couples who do have children think of their relationship as the kind of thing that has value in itself, the likelier they are to have the stability and the love and the kind of communion in which children have the best moral formation.
One quick question from in the audience. I'm not familiar with the book. The question is, are you familiar with Robert Riley's book, Making Gay Okay? I don't know the book. Any opinion, those of you who've read it?
I read half of it, but he's read all of it. So.
Yeah, I mean, so Professor Dr. Riley, I don't think he's a professor, but he comes at it from a slightly different perspective than we do. He has a different take on like the natural law tradition approach to natural law than Sherif, Robbie, and I have. I think it's a good book. It's definitely worth reading. I mean, his basic argument is that the moral evaluation of non-marital sex needs to be part of this discussion, and that part of the problem is that a whole host of non-marital sex has been normalized, and that then opened up the door to just take the next step to including same-sex relationships as marital. and that he goes through this, and then he shows how it plays out in a number of institutions as well, and then he approaches it mainly from he's a West Coast Straussian, if that means anything to you, but that's kind of the intellectual tradition that he is operating from, and he shows that when we replaced Aristotle, who had a conception of human nature based upon function and kind of bodily nature, with Rousseau, who would redefine it in terms of desire, that was the critical philosophical change that was made. That rather than defining marriage and defining morality based on human nature, we came to understand it based on human desire, and that's the seed of all of the problems, because traditionally, classically, you would try to conform your desires to the truth of human nature and human goods, whereas now we were redefining human goods and human nature in terms of what we desired, and that we lost the concept of misplaced desires that had to be governed by right reason. And so he makes that point in a way that I think could be helpful.
Now I do have the need, and I'm going to do it quickly. One question for Sherif that's relevant, I think, to the discussion. Does contraception change the nature of many marriages, making them less of a comprehensive union? And then, so you can be thinking about it, we've talked about marriage should not be instrumental. A quick statement maybe from everyone. What are some of the goods of marriage itself? And then we'll end on that.
Yeah, so on the first question, I do think that the widespread use and acceptance of contraception is perfectly okay. Divorces in people's minds, so to speak, the connection between marriage and family life. Family life starts to look more and more like an option. You know, you could get a dog together, you could have a family together, and what really matters is if you have personal fulfillment. The other thing is it involves the couple in opposing, in a very, very specific way, the very thing about their act that makes it a comprehensive union to begin with. What made it comprehensive, what made it more than an expression of affection, was that it was coordination towards a single end that was bigger than and encompassed the two of them together. And when they set their will against that aspect of the act, it's not fully marital. That's crucial, and the more it takes a kind of cultural hold, the harder it is for people to see why, if marriage is really just about expressing and fostering affection, you need a man and a woman to do it.
Now the final question. What are some of the goods of marriage? You can pick your favorite or however you'd like briefly to do that. Ryan, you want to start?
Well, so I think from our perspective, marriage is, itself is the good. It's an intrinsic good. So to say what are the goods of marriage is to frame the question as if it's instrumental to something else. I ran through a bunch from like a political perspective about why marriage matters in the terms of uniting children with their mom and dad, and then increasing social mobility, decreasing poverty, increasing graduation chances, what Sherif referred to as, a few more points on the SAT, that sort of thing. But I think our fundamental argument is that marriage isn't instrumental either to baby making or to kind of adult emotional satisfaction, but that in and of itself, it is the good that's at stake. So it is its own good.
Other responses?
Within the social sciences, which would look at, and you mentioned this, Richard, as you talked about, that this also ties into our nature and to who we are. There's been much attention in recent years to the reality of attachment needs, and that ultimately even what we express in romantic and sexual relationships largely are symbols and meanings that connect back to our deep and intrinsic need to belong and to love and to be loved. And so this becomes a way that connects to our very nature. And then, of course, it connects that cycle of belonging to the other fundamental aspect of our humanness, which is that we are generational, and that children, even before they have the ability to communicate and to express themselves in other ways, recognize and have this need to belong and to love and to be loved. So it becomes in harmony with our nature, and that becomes both, you can talk about it as the fruits of the goods, of the benefits that a marriage provides, but it also ties to this intrinsic view that it is just inherently connected to who we are and what it means to be human and what the true human condition is.